And it's Jerry Ashton, 15 Minutes of Fact here on WGRNradio.com. 15 Minutes of Fact. Actually, the subject that we're going to be entering into would take probably 15 months of heavy study, given the challenge that it faces or poses for the listener, and certainly for the person who's going to be on the phone with me today. Andrew Ross, professor at NYU. He's been there for 19 years. He's a professor. Prior to that, he was at Princeton. His emphasis is urban studies and labor studies. I first met Andrew Ross when I was visiting the Occupy movement on my own, trying to determine its energy, its strength, its authenticity, which I want you to know, and all of us who are listening to this, it is definitely authentic, and it's definitely alive and well, having just completed its first year in existence. As part of that first year, early on, there were many groups that were vying for attention, many different protests, whether it be LGBT, whether it be unions, whether it be housing, but there was a major interest which grew and grew over time, and that was the subject of debt. Debt. Just to say the word is to be burdened. Democracy and debt. Debt and its effect on the upcoming election. Debt and growth of our country. And for our purposes today, most significantly, debt and higher education and what that means to us as a country. So when I did stumble across one group of people, they were occupied with student debt, still are, and enlarging that. And I followed them carefully. I began to write some blogs about them, and finally began to understand that truly, if there's one lasting thing that's going to come out of Occupy, it's going to be how we change the conversation on debt. So with that, let's say hello to our guest this morning. Andrew, say hello to our listeners. Thank you.
Good morning, Jerry. Good morning, listeners.
I must confess, I get a little tongue-tied about you because you are so well equipped to discuss this subject. Certainly, being a student of labor and lecturing on labor must have prepared you for this, but did it really for what happened in this thing called Occupy?
Well, that's a good question. I had a very steep learning curve on the topic of debt. My response to Occupy, really as a participant, was to throw myself into the anti-debt campaigns or the debt resistance campaigns. I felt that was the most urgent issue that I could work on, and especially student debt in the early months. Given I'm employed at an institution, NYU, that has average student debt on graduation that's 40% above the national average. It's a national leader in that regard. So I became very active in the Occupy student debt campaign, and we functioned as a working group within Occupy for several months until some of the Occupy bureaucracy mutated and parts of it fell apart. The assembly structure fell apart. We continued to work, and in the summer we decided that we wanted to branch out and form coalitions with other people who have been working on debt, and beyond student debt, in other words. And so we formed something called the Strike Debt Initiative and started holding debtors assemblies in New York City parks throughout this last summer.
Well, the thing that intrigues most people, or concerns most people, or confuses most people who are watching what we call Occupy, Grow, and Evolve, is the fact that it seems to be almost organic. For example, you started out primarily concerning yourself with student debt. I think there's a very famous clip of you on YouTube, parts 1 and 2, that start out with, is student debt a form of indenture? And certainly, in my own experience of wandering around the NYU campus, I wrote In February of that year, I wrote a blog called Lenders, Government, and For-Profit Schools, a Love Letter from Your Bill Collector.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in that, I discussed how lip-smacking the debt was for a bill collector, because students were graduating with debt $90,000, $65,000, $20,000, $120,000. Now that had to bother you as a professor and also someone who understood from the point of view of urban and labor studies what that would mean to us in the future. So let's focus on the students first, then we're going to go into strike debt.
Mm-hmm.
Why, given the fact that we're in a knowledge economy, where basically no degree equals no job, at least no worthwhile job, the conditions of that sort of labor are that students are required in this day and age to go into debt. What is your sense of that? What is the history of that?
Well, the history of that is that higher education at least used to be much higher on the list of national priorities in this country, as it still is in many other countries, but in the U.S. has been demoted, and the funding structure for higher education has shifted away from government funding towards individual debt financing on the part of the users, or the supposed beneficiaries of the education system, the students. What this has meant, it's been going on for some time now, but the rate of transfer of responsibility from the government to the individual has increased in recent years. What that has meant is that basically students have to incur a considerable degree of debt in order to prepare themselves for employability in the knowledge economy. They have to take on a huge amount of debt just to position themselves as fit in mind and body for employability. And if they're lucky enough to then be employed, a large part of their income goes to paying off their preparations for employability. Well, and this can take several decades, and this is one of the reasons why some people, including myself, like to describe this as a condition of indenture, where you have to go into debt in order to labor. That's the basic definition of indenture.
Well, that's not any different from the early days of the colonies, in which people were indentured, where they had to work off their entry into that particular society. And on top of that, as things moved along, the worker had to have his own tools and pay for his own tools in order to be able to deliver his services to society at large. And when I think about education in its really necessary sense, education is for the good of society. It's for the good of all the businesses that employ people. So it used to be, back in the day when I went to school, it was inexpensive relatively to go to school. I was prepared well. The government picked up much of the cost, but the beneficiary was really the employee of the employer that I went to. Now, with the idea of removing a fair and equitable tax structure, so that the student is now the debtor, the student is responsible for the education, and businesses still benefit. Is there something wrong with that picture, or am I missing a point here?
There is something wrong with it. For one thing, yes, I agree with you that education is a public good, social good, but it's also been very good for the finance industry, because higher education increasingly approached as a market for generating returns, and all kinds of returns: construction bonds, student debt, all sorts of financial instruments that have been spun out of the tuition bubble. And the government itself, even the government federal loan program, generates returns and revenue for the government at a rate that is unjustifiable, in my opinion, far above the rate at which the government borrows money itself. The bigger challenge, however, right now, and I think everyone recognizes it, even in the halls of Congress, is that students who are graduating have this unsustainable and crushing debt burden. They will never be able to pay off their debts. It's pretty clear. The aggregate student debt is more than $1 trillion at this point. unlike in those early days of colonial indenture, or even today where immigrants often come to this country and others owing money for transit fees and so on and so forth. These bonds are paid off in a relatively short space of time. With student debt, it's a lifetime for most people, and sometimes it can go beyond the grave.
Well, that's where I, at the other end of this world of yours, became alarmed and angered. Student debt is lusted over in the industry that we call debt collections and debt buying. It is the type of debt which is so easily pursued, and the victims, and I'll use that word, are so easily cornered. For example, very few people realize that a debt collector can garnish wages, and even more than that, garnish a Social Security check of a student who has defaulted. They add all kinds of usurious penalties and fees on top of it. Some collectors agencies add a rate of 25% on top of the original debt. So this is unconscionable. There is such a thing as good debt and bad debt. And to me, what qualifies as good debt is that it was entered into in good faith and understanding and not by trickery. And secondly, that people are in a position to benefit from having gone into that debt. And for students today, there's no benefit for going into the debt given the economy and the labor market.
Increasingly, I think that's the perception. It used to be that students, were gambling with their education, and they were gambling with their debt that they could achieve a position within the top quintile of income earners. That's the so-called income gap between, those with a college degree and those without. That advantage has pretty much been demolished. Now that more and more of the wealth and income is going to the 1% rather than the 20% where most students think they can end up. So without that economic, just in terms of economic incentives, without that kind of reward at the end of the road, it's just not clear. Even if you approach education as a bargain for which you trade the wages of the future, it's not clear that it's even worth it. And more students are beginning to perceive that. If they're coming from middle-class families that are strapped, that's a real dilemma.
Well, I won't even go into the complicity of the universities and the for-profit systems that in my view, all too often prey on the student at an early age, not truly understanding what that means, although they're, thanks to people like you and Strike Debt, are going to learn more about it. When you figure that up to a third of student loans are defaulting, that this is really the next large bubble, that after the mortgage bubble, this is the one that's going to happen. What separates the student debtor from other forms of debt, like the more publicized mortgages and foreclosures on homes, is that this is a very separate thing. It's an individual thing. It involves shame, humiliation, and you and I both know that has led not only to divorces, disruptions in families, but also to suicides. So that is the type of pressure that's being placed individually on students, but there's something called collective power. And that's how the union movement was created, that individual workers that were preyed upon finally realized that there was strength in numbers and that they were able to fight back an unjust system by forming unions. Now, that, of course, leads to the next part of the questioning that I will have for you, which deals with this national initiative, or will become an initiative, where you'd once started out with a pledge of refusal, asking students to, 1 million of them, to sign on to refuse to pay their debt, only if 1 million people signed up. And now you've moved on to something called Strike Debt, in which you've gone beyond the students. So give us an idea of what that evolution has meant and what it means for us in the future.
Well, we did. The Occupy Student Debt Campaign did indeed float the pledge of refusal, as you described it, for all sorts of reasons. We didn't get the numbers that we wanted, and so we're rethinking our strategy, and we realized with the Strike Debt Initiative now, which is on a much broader plane, with all sorts of different kinds of debt: medical debt, housing debt, credit card debt, municipal debt, and so on and so forth, we're realizing that we really do need a debtors movement, with branches in different places. Whether we call it a union or not, we haven't decided. But these would be branches of debtors who would decide for themselves what kind of collective action they want to take, whether it takes the form of a debt strike, if that's going to be useful to them, or whether they want to analyze how municipal debt works in their cities, because although there are a lot of people who actually don't have debts, we're all debtors, because the impact or the costs of things like municipal debt are passed on to us in one fashion or another. Sovereign debt of nations is passed on to its citizenry. So we're all debtors, and current levels of debt are simply unsustainable. So we do need, our politicians, we recognize, are not going to provide debt relief. That's been pretty clear. So we need people to take this issue into their own hands and empower themselves by banding together. Because individually, as defaulters, we have no power. There are tens of millions of defaulters out there who have, in effect, resisted paying their debts, but it has no collective impact because they do it on an individual basis. If we do it together, then the idea is that we can weaken the hold that financial creditors have on our lives, and that we can establish a credit economy as an alternative that isn't simply one that is geared at fast profits, long-term profits.
Well, let's take a look at every brick that's being placed in this edifice of yours. One of them being the most recent fruits of the labor of Occupy, in particular Strike Debt of Occupy Wall Street, their project, which is the Debt Resistors Operations Manual. For the listener, I want you to know, if you go to strikedebt.org, strikedebt.org, you'll be able to locate this manual. Is it downloadable, or is it something that has to be mailed out?
Downloadable.
It is downloadable. I have a physical copy of it in my hand, and it is, someone like me with a financial background, pretty impressive, very impressive. And it's going to be, as it dedicates itself, on the back cover it says, "To the financial establishment of the world, we have only one thing to say: we owe you nothing." Now, it seems to me that the good and strong and Americans among us are going to be listening to that statement and say, that is thoroughly beyond the pale. Of course we owe people things. Of course we owe for the house we bought, the credit card debt we ran up, the student loans. This is who we are as a people. We pay what we owe. Yet this manual has appeared now. There's a conflict between these two. We have a cognitive dissonance here. People who are raised to pay what they owe, and people who just said, "I owe you nothing." How do you resolve that?
Well, the manual itself contains a lot of useful advice to debtors of all sorts in different categories of debt, about how they can either negotiate or escape or contest their debt. And a lot of the information there comes actually from industry insiders who know some of the nefarious practices which the lending industry uses to extract profits from people. And although the worst excesses come from, predatory lenders and predatory collection agencies, we think that the entire system, the entire lending system, is close to being illegitimate for all sorts of reasons. That you mentioned the morality of paying back your debts. This is a morality that really only applies to the little people. it doesn't seem to apply to the banking industry. We've seen banks are the biggest debt resistors of all. They don't expect their debts to be paid off by themselves. They expect their debts to be paid off by the taxpayer. We've seen this over the last 4 years.
They've been very successful at that.
They've been very successful at that, and I think it's being exposed. That assumption on the part of the finance industry that, the little people have to pay off their debts, but on Wall Street they'll laugh in your face if you say you have to pay off your debts.
Well,
so there's a double standard there that has become really exposed to public scrutiny.
As the chant of the occupiers as they stormed the barricades of Wall Street is they got bailed out, we got sold out, and that is one of the essential ingredients that the listener must grasp, is that all these trillions of dollars have gone to bail out the bankers from their mistakes, and the people who have ended up paying for those mistakes are the taxpayer, and yet government continues to collude with what I consider to be dubious, if not immoral, lending practices and interest rates, usury, that once upon a time would have a merchant put in jail for doing what they're doing today. So we've evolved to the state now where people realize that, yes, I do want a home. Yes, I do want to buy this car. Yes, I do need an education. But the only way to do that is to now put myself subject or indentured to a system in which I have little or no control other than the few services that the government offers people to help them fight back. So are you suggesting that outside of federal programs that can help the debtor fight back, that the debtors movement is going to be more important than that?
I'm convinced it will be. I think the way I would put it is that in the era of industrialization, conflict over wages was really the big struggle for people who were struggling to make it into the middle class. In our times, it's going to be the struggle over debt that will be the big conflict of our times. Not because wage conflict is over, it never will be, but because debt is quite literally the wages of the future. That is what debt is. And so it is a labor struggle in a way. It's just taking the form of how people can provide debt relief for themselves, because it's pretty clear the government is not going to do it for us. And so it is up to us
to take
these things into our own hands.
Well, you've had some recent experience with a government that wants to, shall we say, discourage people from an organized resistance to the status quo. Most recently, on Occupy's birthday, you were invited to stay at what is called the Stony Lonesome. In my day, you were in the Slammer, the Hoosgow. So apparently, this came about from something you were doing at Occupy. What is it that caught the attention of the police to have them arrest you and put you in jail?
Well, I was one of 200 arrestees on that day, and most of the people were arrested by being picked off the sidewalk, which is entirely illegal. It seems that the police in New York want to make just proximity to occupiers be an arrestable offense. My own arrest was slightly more meaningful because it was in the context of a civil disobedience action that Strike Debt was doing at a J.P. Morgan Chase building. And we were protesting what we believe is some of the criminal activities. And it's a long list, a very long record on the part of that particular bank. And so we were arrested for protesting. The right to protest is something that is becoming criminalized.
Well, you don't understand. Obviously, you don't understand that you are allowed freedom of speech as long as you have permission to exercise it.
Well,
I think I'm missing something there too. What could that be? You have the freedom. You have the freedom for right of assembly. You have absolutely the freedom for the right of assembly, except that you need these permits, except that you need the permission in order to do that. And if they don't provide you the permission, then obviously you are going against the law. So you and 200 people. Let me see. Let me bounce that off with the number of arrests made of bankers because of this. Is that balancing out?
Yeah, there's a little deficit there, Jerry.
They're talking about a trade deficit. Not only did they you got bailed out in this case, but unfortunately you had to do it on your own. So you got bailed out, and the ones who control the enforcement structure, we'll call that the police department, are
very true.
Just exercising that abuse. That has to be seen more and more, even though Middle America is abhorrent to the fact that the police department is sort of being used not to protect the citizen, but to protect the status quo. It's going to take a pretty major impact, or a major, maybe a public display, I don't know. What is it going to take for people to get to the understanding that we're not quite as free as we think we are?
That's a good question. Clearly, the response of the authorities to Occupy over the last year has, for those who want to look it squarely in the eye, been very unconstitutional. And there's been an active campaign, a coordinated campaign to suppress civil liberties and the right to protest. This is the early years of Occupy, very early stages. For a lot of people who are in the core of Occupy, they're in it for the long run. And if you think about the duration of something like the civil rights movement, any of the great social movements that have transformed American culture and society, and to some degree the economy, they certainly didn't achieve their results within the space of 1 year. You haven't heard the last from us, and as far as the debtors movement goes, this is something I think that most Americans, if they had it explained to them in a persuasive fashion, would recognize that this is something that is fundamentally in the American grain and absolutely necessary right now, given the crushing debt burden that our government will not protect its citizens against.
Well, it always amazed me when I listened to the so-called elected representatives of the people that are solidly in the hands of, in the pockets of Wall Street and big business, as they vote against their own constituency's best interests. The fact that the entire bill to put every student through college, from the entire educational system, all the way up to and including graduate school for those qualified, would be a fraction of the defense bill, a fraction of the amount of money that it takes to put us on war footing rather than peace footing. But going to the idea of we're in it for the long run, there's someone who appropriated your name and then added his to it that I found to be a bit offensive. Have you ever heard of an Andrew Ross Sorkin?
Yes, I have.
I'm sure you have. He's a columnist for the New York Times.
Yeah, he's a business columnist.
Business columnist, and very much so. It might as well be a division of the Wall Street Journal on site at the New York Times. But he belittles the Occupy movement, and in a more recent column of his, said that at best we might be a footnote in history, if that. I don't get that, because having been involved both on the periphery of reporting and chronicling what's happening in Occupy, and also being in a number of meetings where the occupiers have put their souls and their time and their labor and efforts into making a positive change in the United States, this is the thing that will not go away, and I feel that he's going to have to be writing an apology column, if not within another year before our second birthday, certainly in the future. So, tell us about
I think the writers and columnists like that aren't in the business of producing apologies, but they would be welcome if it came.
Well, I want to thank you very much for the time that you've invested with us today, Andrew. I do want to be sure that every thought that you have that will help us understand this idea of strike debt and debtors resistance be understood. Is there anything that we've not touched on today that the listener needs to know?
There's so much, Jerry, but I think we covered some good ground today. I hope that listeners who are interested will, first of all, check out our website and contact us if they want to get involved, because we are interested in setting up local branches of strike debt in towns and cities across the U.S.
Well, that website address again is strikedebt.org. People who would like to reach you personally can use this email address. It's andrewtross@gmail.com. That's ANDREWTROSS, all one word, at gmail.com. And this is Jerry Ashton with, let's not call it 15 minutes of fact anymore, because the subjects are just getting longer and more interesting. But signing off once again, thanking you for listening. You can reach me personally at writtenoffusa@gmail.com, or visit my book and process website, writtenofamerica.com.